Good morning. It is 8:30 and it's time to begin. Mikey, will you please call the roll of the committee, make sure we've got quorum?
I please allow to. Dr. Chase?
Here.
Dr. Marshall? Mr. Martin?
Here.
Mr. Mosley?
Here.
Ms. Parker is not here. Mr. Stavros?
Here.
Mr. Chair, you have a quorum.
Thank you, Mikey. Good morning. Welcome to the Budget Committee meeting. We've got time this morning to go through the budget. We want to look at it closely. As I begin, I do just want to make a few brief opening remarks, the first of which is we're doing something new. This time we've changed direction, we've listened to input, and we've tried to come up with a budget that categorizes items rather than just lists them, seriate them, and spells them out. So there may be some oversights in this budget. There may be areas that have been missed as we've tried to coalesce university desires, and we'll have an opportunity to talk about those. But off the top, I want to thank staff for spending a lot of time trying to gather these items into some functional methodology that then we can come back through and establish priorities for, work with our boards of trustees, and then make certain that we meet the needs of the university system while responding to the legislature's wishes that we try to narrow our scope and our message. So we're doing a lot in this budget. A lot of it is different, and we're just going to have to work through it together, and it may take a budget cycle to get there, but we're very optimistic that we're going to make this work. That said, I'm going to ask Tim Jones to come up and walk us through the budget that we talked a great deal about yesterday, kind of at the 10,000-foot level. But before we do that, let me just, I'm sorry, Tim, he jumped up and sat back down. Before we do that, let me just give a couple of quick caveats. Over the last 24 hours, we've already seen a couple of areas where perhaps there have been items that didn't fit into this new paradigm as clearly as we'd like. And what I want to ask the presidents to do is let us know between now and the September meeting when we adopt the final budget what those are. For instance, we heard from Dr. Emmons yesterday about a FAMU issue dealing with IFAS and matching funds, which is important. We heard from UCF about some Burnham issues and some state commitments that we need to put in recurring. There may be others out there, and if that is the case, presidents and provosts, please get with Tim, get with the chancellor, let them know if we've missed something glaring that we can then incorporate into the budget in the September budget meeting when we pass the final budget. So I'll repeat that as we continue, but it's very important that if things have been missed, some of it may be intentional, some of it may not. So if you feel we've missed something, let us know, and we'll try to make that work. Additionally, there are pieces in this budget that I will be talking about that, at my suggestion, at least committee members, I'm going to want to move offline. Again, in the desire to get this budget put together to reflect the interests of all of us, staff has compiled a budget that presumes that we may be adopting things in the future. So there are items in here that we have not adopted as a board as a priority yet, specific items, and I'm going to want to, and when Tim goes through them, I will suggest that perhaps we need to move those off until the appropriate committees meet and adopt those items and then put them back in the budget in September. I am very reticent to backdoor agenda items into the budget. Not that that's what staff was doing, but it could certainly appear that way until they're fully vetted in our various committees. So a couple of committees may need to meet between now and September, or at the September meeting before the next budget committee, so that we can properly include items or not. And there are a few areas that we have left out of this budget that I'll also want to talk about as we continue. So it should be an interesting morning. Hopefully we'll get some good yet brief dialogue, and we can work through this process together. The goal is going to be one unified message, transparency in process, transparency in goal setting. And with that, let me ask Tim Jones to come up and just start walking us through our budget process. Tim, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's go back to we'll start with page 17 of your notebooks, which is the E&G core budget we talked about yesterday. And the process that we're looking at is really breaking our core budget down into three areas. First area dealing with student success initiatives, which start on row 8 through 19. Efficiencies through shared resources, which start on rows 20 through 25. then the last group of issues starting on row 27. So whereas in the past, we've submitted to the legislature unique issues for each one of these, we're looking at rolling these up into broad categories, broad lumps, and submitting those to the legislature and asking them, when they appropriate their funds, to appropriate to us in a lump sum so the board can make the allocations based on whatever resources are available at the time of the appropriation. Mr. Chair, did you want me to go through each of the issues underneath the student success programs, or
Yeah, I think each of these, since these are the larger group items, I think it'd be important that we at least talk about each of those issues. Tim, I think there's not that many subcategories and we can get through it fairly quickly. I do want to be clear, as Tim just pointed out, the idea is that we will get the lump sum funding and then the board would fund these incremental increases subject to priorities which we will be establishing over the next several weeks and months as a board. Base budget, core budget, the $2.9 billion and change that is already in place would be untouched by this board. Obviously, this is just the incremental funding that would be the initial lump funding component that we will be talking about, and again, setting priorities with input from boards of trustees and this committee. So, Tim, if you want to go ahead and start there.
Okay, the first issue is performance incentive funding, and we heard about this yesterday. All of these are from Dr. Lamont yesterday.
Tim, I'm having a hard time hearing you.
This is still a work in progress in terms of the actual allocation on how this would work, and we hope to have that nailed down by our September meeting. The next group of issues, student success programs, as it's in the budget, is really three different issues. A TRIP program, working on faculty salaries, a graduate student teaching assistant program, which provide a health supplement for those students. This is an issue we've had in our budget for a couple years now. And a final issue dealing with tracking retention, graduation programs that universities can implement.
Okay. Let me stop there. There are a couple of items in there, for instance, and we're running up into the first example. I know we have talked about graduate student assistance support. I know that there seems to be some support for that. However, our Student Affairs Committee has not voted on this issue yet, has not determined the parameters of it, and this is one of those items that I would like to move offline, at least as graduate student assistance support, into a waiting period until the Student Affairs Committee meets before our budget meeting next month and approves or changes or modifies this request. Is there any objection from anybody on the committee to that move? Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, Chancellor.
Just as a point of reference, the board in two prior budget iterations has approved similar initiatives. So I think it is appropriate that we do take it back to committee. This is a little bit different as an issue than the student insurance issue that we, as you well know, that we discussed the other day, and we'll be happy to identify why it's different and why it's, if you will, primordial to our graduate competitiveness.
And be clear, Chancellor, the write-up in the budget was well done. It was clear. Market forces are clear. And by moving this item or any other item offline does not in any way mean we won't support it, or I personally don't support it, but I do support the process. And we haven't run this one through the Student Affairs Committee yet. It was considered, it was talked about in Boca, but we never got a vote. So the numbers, the percentages, perhaps more, perhaps less, I think the Student Affairs should make that decision. But, yes, Dr. Head.
Directed to this item but another, and so if you're not through, please.
I'm through with this one. I was going to go to the Teaching Research and Incentive Program next.
Well, that's where I would just voice a concern. We have continued those programs on our campus straight through, and they've worked very well, but they are constantly a source of some concern, one might say even consternation, to our faculty bargaining unit. And so I would just ask that we be cognizant that that a great program like this may well occasion a lot, when you get to the campus level, there may be a lot of concerns that have to be worked through. I would support the program, but I don't think we ought to go into it not realizing that it will cause our faculty union a good bit of heartburn.
Dr. Chase?
Now, I would note that when TIP was initially instituted in the state, it was done by the legislature with legislative rule, which was outside of bargaining at that time. Now it's within bargaining if they exist anywhere in the state. And so it is a real issue as to whether or not you put this program in place, whether it's going to be bargained or whether the parameters are established by the Board of Governors ahead of time and done through legislative intent in order to get the money distributed equitably to faculty.
What if we do this? Chancellor, would this be a solution, or perhaps a partial solution? We leave the incentive funds in, we want them in there, we ask the Council of Academic Vice Presidents to come up with some parameters for this research and incentive program that can perhaps be adopted by the legislature at that point in time? So, could we ask?
With input from the ACFS, please.
Certainly. Chancellor, could we ask staff to work with the Council of Academic VPs? Great. Any other questions on the initial student success grouping? Thank you, Tim. Go ahead.
The next issue on row 11 is really continuation of the funding we got this year for the Enlace program. This will just allow it to be expanded to the remaining 4 institutions that aren't able to participate this year because we didn't get the full amount that we requested. Row 12 is funding for an additional auxiliary learning aids, so our campuses can work with various disabled populations that we have on our campuses. Row 13 is an initiative we've seen in the past. This is a $4 million to increase engineering students. Then rows 14 through 17 deal with enrollment funding. And you heard about this yesterday from Nate Johnson, funding for currently unfunded students, flow-throughs, natural growth, and community college transfers. And as he indicated, we'll have to revisit this issue as we get into fall and we get actual numbers and know where universities stand in terms of actual enrollment. So this is kind of a moving target at this point.
Right.
Then the last issue, row 18, this year we received about $42 million in enrollment growth funding. 3.5 of that was non-recurring. So we're just asking the state to come back and reappropriate funds to continue the support for existing students.
Right.
And that takes care of the first group of initiatives.
Thank you, Tim. Any questions on that grouping that Tim just discussed? I need to indicate for the record I serve on the board of Enlace, so when we make a vote on that issue today and in September, I will need to disclose that conflict once again. Dr. Ginchef?
I know that this is going to come up later, but Chancellor, you had gotten a group together this summer following the Virginia Tech incident to talk about campus safety and then came to the legislature, excuse me, with the proposal. Is there anything that's going to be initiated for campus safety in the budget?
Dr. Ginchef, that's one of the areas that I was referring to at the beginning that I think we will need to create a Section 4. We did go to the legislature for $3.5 million, some recurring, some non-recurring. And I appreciate you bringing it up, and we're going to hear from the task force this morning. So I think that as we come back in September, that's one of those areas that we're going to need to add back into this budget to make certain that we do send a consistent message and do what we need to do to protect our students. So thank you for bringing that up. Other questions on the section Tim just discussed? Tim, please continue.
Okay, the next group of issues starting on row 21, FCLA. This is an issue we've seen in the past to purchase digital materials. Number 22 is planning dollars for the research vessel at FIO. Number 23, $1 million for the University of Preston, Florida. 1.3 for initiative on global education, and then $3 million, a partnership program with community colleges and the Distance Learning Consortium.
Great. Yes, Governor Pappas.
The Initiative for Global Education, I'm not sure I understand what it is. I mean, it looks to me that it's a heavy emphasis on pre-K through 12 and community college entities. If you could just explain to me what the role of the university system is in that function.
I think I'll defer to Dr. Lamont on that one.
Mr. Chairman, subsequent to 9/11, there was a tremendous cultural change, too fast to be called an evolution in universities across this country, and international activities took a nosedive, everything from international enrollments to study abroad programs and even foreign languages. This year, the federal government recognized this with a study by the Abraham Lincoln Commission, making recommendations that the country renew its compact and its belief in a multicultural, multilingual education, called for more study abroad programs, more student and faculty interchanges, and focus on critical languages, which are dearly needed more than we ever needed before. Particularly Florida, when you localize that argument, it gets to the issue of whether or not Florida will be a hub of international activity. We counseled, the reason that there is a K-12 and community college focus is because we felt that it was important to include everybody in the notion of an initiative for international education that would be a combination of, it would, rather than a bricks and mortar, it would take the best of the best around the state university system in terms of courses, in terms of foreign language, and we would be clear to work with K-12 as well to provide more foreign language education, increased opportunities for study abroad and interchange, with the idea that a major portion of this budget would be private and matched in nature, so that we would have an opportunity also to work with economic development players in the state. The Chancellor may have more to add to that, but that's my comment.
There are two critical issues for our competitiveness as it relates to our students in the context of the international environment. One is their sensitivity to other cultures and their ability to communicate, and hopefully the likelihood that they would have a second or even a third language, and particularly a second or a third language in the dominant languages that are emerging in the 21st century global economy. We're not doing enough less commonly taught language instruction. That's going to be critical for Florida's competitiveness. And second of all, as it relates to our students' opportunity to study abroad, the data vary, but right now less than 1% of our 300,000 students are going abroad every year. Less than 1%. I would submit to you that that number is inexcusable for the type of state that we are and the type of state we must become in order to stay competitive. And it's very difficult for our institutions to find a way to get our students abroad. Fortunately, students that do have the means can do that. Students that do not have the means have a much greater difficulty. So this initiative will be designed to foster less commonly taught languages through consortia of specialists, both from the community colleges as well as from the universities on one hand, and on the other, to get more students abroad, particularly those who have less financial wherewithal to do that. And I would welcome the opportunity to discuss that in a committee setting. I think that's appropriate, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Chancellor. In fact, this component, which again, I may or may not support, I don't know enough about it, and the board hasn't discussed it, as well as the $1.5 million component, because we've talked about it repeatedly, but I don't think had a final vote for the boat review, the vessel. Thank you, Governor Pappas. Both of those, one we have not discussed and voted on, which I'd love to learn more about, and the other we have discussed but not voted on. I'd love to refer both of those, keep a holding place in this budget, but have them processed through their committee as well before our September meeting.
I'd like to raise just another issue, which is, I think that the Global Education Initiative is so important that it is in fact underfunded in this page.
And that may
So while
come
there
out
may
of
be
meeting.
concerns over that, I think it's so important to the state of Florida that it actually may need more funding when it comes out of committee than is put in here.
And that may well be the case, Dr. Chase. Again, we haven't had the opportunity as a board or as a committee to better discuss it. I don't think anyone objects to the idea or the concept other than the process. I'm sorry, Governor Duncan.
Actually, it's probably for Madam Chairman. But what committee does the global initiative come through? I think so. I just, okay.
Or student affairs, because it directly deals with students' enhancement, education enhancement.
So Governor Gibbons
Yes.
handle that. Governor Pappas?
I would just like to see some data to support if there are trend lines or information in accordance with the chancellor's report, that would help me a lot, because it's a little squishy for me right now.
I know you want to move on, but just briefly, we have a white paper on the subject that has a lot of comparative data, and we spent an hour with the president of Associated Industries of Florida, and is very interested in partnering with us on this one. So we'll get it into a committee where we can show it off to you, if you will.
Thank you.
For a point of information, the National Geographic website has a lot of data on how badly or poorly educated the American public is with regard to geographic literacy in particular, and in terms of preparing American students for a global economy. So you can go to the Geographic website and pick up some of this stuff.
Chairman Lewis, and I would also like, and during this discussion, to direct staff to give us a proposal on how the money would be distributed to the universities, the process, if it would go to the universities for their selection of students, how that would be done.
Yes, Governor Stavros.
I would like to ask President Genshaft to talk a little bit about the Patel Institute for Global Solutions and how that fits in here.
It's all a part of it. I think that Dr. Patel gave over $14 million to set up the Patel Institute for Global Solutions, and said that we're not interested in a think tank. We're interested in a think tank, but do tank, that it's to be very active in issues that deal with education, health, it's global issues. We have it up and running, and it deals with all kinds of international and global affairs. They are not the ones, however, that send the students for study abroad. That's our international office. But through our research dollars and through the dollars that we've been given, and then more that are generated, it's all to work on global issues, economic, whatever.
So if there's no objection from the committee, then I'd like to move those two items offline into a committee hearing before September. Yes, Governor Martin.
As I recall, either in October or November of last year, we had a special meeting in Orlando, the Roosevelt Center, talking about commerce, global international commerce, and our keynote speaker, as I recall, was very passionate about the fact that we do need to make sure that we have opportunities for our students to involve in these types of programs. So I'd like to also ask maybe the chancellor to give us an update on that meeting that we had, what has taken place since then. I think we also need to pull that discussion into this as well.
Sure, whereas that leads us to the point that, as Governor Martin says, it's directly related to economic development. So there will be in student affairs, it certainly bears a direct tie to that. Thank you for that.
And the Associated Industries partnership sounds terrific as well. So, I mean, I think all of it works. I just want to get it vetted through committee before we put it into our budget. Thanks. Anything else, Dr. Lamar?
No, sir.
Thank you. Other questions? Thanks. Tim, you want to continue?
The next group of issues start on Road 27. The first one is the FAU partnership. This will finish the final year of the phase-in of that program, $3.3 million. Once that is appropriate, I think they have about $12 million in their base to continue that partnership. Road 29 is a new issue dealing with financial and HR management systems on our campuses. Provide them resources to continue to implement various modules and interfaces for their computer systems. Rows 30 and 31 are continuation issues, plant operations and maintenance funding for new facilities. Row 32 is New College of Florida's final year of a 3-year request for infrastructure support. And row 33 is funding to support basic operational cost increases on our campuses. That issue has been in our budget since 2004 when we adopted the funding model that had 3 components. That funding model included funds for enrollment growth, a workload issue for IPAS, and an inflationary request to cover just basic cost increases on campus. So, no, sir, it's not new.
Other questions on this grouping? Yes, Governor Duncan.
I apologize. I missed asking my question on the online instruction in line 25. Whenever
Absolutely.
you feel it's appropriate, it's like...
This will be a great time.
Okay. On the budget and I understand the importance of our partnerships with the community colleges on this one, but this is one of those that I've continued to be, I guess, confused by the different initiatives that we've had going in distance learning within our system as a system. I know West Florida has done some phenomenal things. I know UCF has. I know everyone has done disparate, great things in this area. And I guess I question, why aren't we looking at or addressing what can be leveraged system-wide on distance learning and addressing that as part of this budget request? Or where that priority to what this part of the priority is in relation to that, because to me that's a very important issue, and I continue to see more money being spent by everybody on it, but not necessarily holistically.
I'm going to ask Ari to come back up and speak to that one again.
Well, I think your points are well taken, and the bottom line is that in the grand scheme of things, if the principal filter, again, is what's best for the student, there are things in this budget that are certainly student-centered, but it would not be my top priority either. I do think that the distance learning consortium which we have is conceived to be functioning like our Center for Library Automation, whereby we receive discounts by buying in bulk. And the consortium has been very effective in doing that. In order to keep the consortium vibrant, it's important for both the community colleges and the state university system to fund it to some extent. A particular product, if you were to ask about what about the particular products here, there are several that, as you can see, are joint ventures with the community colleges, and the online advising, 24/7 advising, seems to me to be very important because it ties back exactly to something that all institutions are not capable of doing, and that's providing 24/7 working with students in advising, which leads to retention, which leads to graduation. So that would be my response, but I understand your points and they're well taken.
Mr. Chairman, would this not be possibly another area that would be appropriate, like the security? This is an important area because it sounds like this is kind of one piece of the equation, but it's not really addressing the other piece of the equation, if I understood the answer correctly. As far as how we might better leverage what we're doing in the system. And, yeah, I think that would be an important thing that I'd like to see where or how that might fit in, if that can go through whatever committee would be appropriate as well.
Are you suggesting moving the budget line off until we get that result, or leaving the budget line in place and then asking the chancellor to convene the appropriate teams from the universities to have that dialogue, Governor?
I don't have a problem with what we're doing here. I guess I don't know that we're really prioritizing things over another. I just feel like I'm missing a piece of the equation for the discussion.
What we'd like to do, Chancellor, who can you convene with the appropriate parties to have that dialogue in the next month or two? I'd prefer to leave the budget item in, but to convene and have that dialogue.
Well, I think the appropriate place to start would be with the provost, the chief academic officers, who understand the relationship between the online instruction and their academic work plan. And so I'd begin with them. And you all may recall that one of the points raised indeed in the Pappas report was we probably can do better in this area.
Right.
So we're moving from a period in which we emphasize a great deal of entrepreneurship and decentralization to a period where we might have some coalescence around some programs. But I would want to have that discussion first with the provost. So that would be the appropriate place to start.
President Kinship?
Before I came to Florida, I was in the State University of New York, and they started the SUNY Learning Network. You might want to just touch base with Christine Hale, who has all 64 colleges and universities together on one online service.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam President. Other issues in this group? Thank you, Governor Duncan. Go ahead, Tim.
That concludes the E&G core budget issues. Do you want to move to the special units?
Yes. Okay. I'm having a hard time hearing you, Tim.
We'll move to the special units page, which is on page 42. I have included in the governor's packets an updated spreadsheet. The one in the original packet did not factor in an estimated 4% budget reduction that may occur in special sessions, whereas the page on the E&G core budget did that, but this page did not. So you do have an updated sheet in your packet.
The main effect of that updated sheet was UF-IFAS. Were there any other major issues on the update?
Well, basically what that shows, potentially there could be a 4% budget cut to each of those special unit categories. We don't know what will happen, but this is just an estimate of what the impact would be if there was a 4% across the board reduction.
Gotcha.
So it affects the bottom line percentage for all of the special units.
Hopefully we will know that before our September board meeting. Special session should end prior to our meeting, correct?
It begins on September 18th, but they've allowed maybe 3 weeks. So it may not be over until after our board meeting.
Okay. Well, we'll have to just roll with that. Thanks, Tim.
The first issue of row 6 is a workload issue for IFAS. This is part of the 3 issues that the board approved back in May of 2004 to provide funding for workload increases for their extension and research functions. Row 7 is a similar issue related to the one on the E&G core budget we talked about a second ago. Row 8 is a base funding adjustment for the UF and USF medical schools. This was an issue that was in our budget last year also, but it brings their base funding up to an agreed upon level of about $44,000 to $45,000 per student. Row number 9 is to replace some non-recurring funds that the FSU Medical School has received the last 2 years for 4 of its clinical sites. Row 10 is related to FSU Medical School's continued phase-in of their student component. They will not be fully up and running with their maximum number of students for, I believe, another 2 years, 09, 010. Is that correct, Dr. Abel?
Entering class in 08 will be full level.
So this is the funding associated with this, and this is really the tuition support that'll be provided by the students because they have already received their support of state funding. Row 11 is the year 2 planning funds.
Hold on, Chairman Roberts.
Dr. Abel, remind me, how many students will that be at our full level?
120 per class, or 480.
Good, thank you.
And is this just for budget authority?
This is, yes.
It's not a budget request?
No, it's just, no.
Just want to make sure.
Just the tuition associated with that additional students, right? Year 2 planning funds for the FIU and UCF medical schools is the last of the medical education group issues. And then row 12 is some funding, continued funding for Centers of Excellence, plus a small amount of money to do an evaluation of previously awarded dollars to Centers of Excellence. And the last issue is our estimate of major gift matching funds that we'll need. This number will probably change as we get closer to session and we actually have those matching requests on board. But that's a review of the special units and state initiatives.
Thank you, Tim. Questions or comments? Yes, Dr. Kavanaugh?
Governor Perez, it sounded like your opening comments that you were very familiar with kind of the IFAS issue here and the differential on the money that we're talking about. And if I understood your opening comments, that we'll have an opportunity to provide Tim and others with updated information between now and the next board meeting.
That is correct.
Thank you.
Governor Temple.
Yeah, I don't understand the medical part of it. I thought the original agreement was that, and I don't know why these are all on the same page, I thought the original agreement was that we were going to expand our existing medical programs and that the new medical schools were going to stand on their own and not get all mixed up with all the other medical schools. And this whole thing confuses me because it kind of like throws them all into one lump basket where they all may be affected equally and they're not supposed to be. So,
well, and it shouldn't work that way, Governor Temple. I think what you're seeing is this one lump basket in our budget committee presentation. They've got their separate lines. The additional funding, the catch-up funding for the base funding for USF will be a separate request, as will the year 2 funding for each of UCF and FIU, as will the separate requests for FIU and Miami.
And are we going to get into today on the 2 new medical schools as to how this request compares to what we originally were given, projected, and
now would be the
what's
time,
the difference and what's the overruns? And
now would be the time to do that, Governor Temple.
Yeah.
In fact, I'll start that conversation for you if you like. Well, before we do that, are there any other questions with regard to any other component of the special units? Yeah, Dr. Abel.
On the $30,250,000, that $30 million is coming off to do what? Coming off the top of the 100 to do what?
That is next year's budget request, Dr. Abel.
That would be in addition to
the 100 million
that you're getting this year.
It's 30 million new money there, and then $250,000 for analysis and review of the respective proposals.
Before we get into the medical school discussion, one question that I had raised, and I don't know if there's a consensus with the presidents or not, but the World Class Scholars program was pretty well received and pretty successful, I believe, and is there consideration of putting that in, or would there be a priority compared to Centers of Excellence and the funding if you one or the other? I mean, we've kind of focused in on Centers of Excellence with this. I don't think the Economic Development Committee has really talked about it in terms of if one's a priority over the other, but I would be curious as to the dialogue because I think the World Class Scholars program was important as well.
Thoughts from any presidents?
I think it's a great idea. Helping to bring in outstanding scholars makes all the difference.
Again, I don't know in the scheme of priorities where it falls, and maybe that's the chancellor. I mean, can you maybe speak to that?
We're mindful of the budget difficulties, and we believe that there's a constituency in the Capitol perhaps a stronger constituency in the capital for the centers of excellence because of its direct and immediate linkage to Enterprise Florida, as we heard yesterday in the strategic direction of the state. So I think that's why we decided to focus on centers of excellence. But I would be happy to have a further conversation with that because under the current circumstances, we're likely to lose as many eminent scholars as we gain, and I'll take any additional resources I can to keep our competitive edge.
Well, and again, I'm not trying to say I favor one over the other. I think it's a dialogue we should have.
I have a question
Governor McDivitt.
on the topic of the Centers for Excellence, and you don't need to answer it here, but I was not able to come into your meeting yesterday. I was in a different one, but the thing that has concerned me about the Centers for Excellence is the fact that on the first year, we didn't have all that much money, so the amounts of money that were given for those projects did not strike me as sufficient to actually do anything with those projects. So my question is, how do we have to wait 3 or 4 years before we determine whether or not these are effective and whether they're going to require additional continuing financial support? I mean, these are the things that kind of concern me about it, because if you had Centers for Excellence where people came in with proposals and they had partners and they had other funding and they had a plan that went out multiple years and they had a commercialization plan attached to it and so on, it'd be a little bit different.
That is what they're supposed to do. I think
Well,
the plan is that they're supposed to be self-funding, and they are supposed to bring in the additional resources, and they're not supposed to be a recurring point. I think there's, and we have addressed in the thing that the package you'll see for our later discussion on this year's criteria, considerable thought has gone into the accountability measures and how we can try to get some early indicators for success on that, as well as addressing the existing centers and how they may reapply in the context of this year's money if there is a gap or a need because of the budgets from last year, that hasn't been precluded for this year's round. So I think we've come a long way on the accountability and the ability to look at that side of it. I'm not sure if that addresses your question, but I mean, the proposals are all very much geared towards and are supposed to put into the thought of how they become self-sufficient during the time period.
Other questions before we address Governor Temple?
Can I just come back to it? And I'm sorry for being late, but on the first page, before we get into the details on this page, on the first page, are we going to, I mean, some of these programs are continuing and some of them are new. I'd say most of them are new. Are we going to prioritize those?
The plan, Governor,
we're going to prioritize those so when they go to the legislature, at least somebody knows what we think is more important and less important.
Let me back up a bit. We have some of the plans that are brand new. If you recall, we pulled off the agenda to hear about and then put back on the agenda. We've got these grouped into lumps, and the idea subsequent will be the board will prioritize each of these projects once the amount of funding is received. We could certainly probably do that in advance of the funding. The message we've gotten was, give us your categories, give us your funding requests. So that's what we have done, but certainly the board will prioritize each of these areas so that we can move forward with funding in order or percentage funding depending upon what the legislature gives us. But this board will do that.
So you're saying they're going to do that after we know what our funding is?
We'll do it internally, certainly, and then after we know what the funding is, we will fund based on those priorities. Is that helpful? Not helpful?
Yeah, no, it's good.
Okay. Dr. Genshaw.
Last year, when we went through as a group and we all supported medical education, both to existing schools and new schools. Some of it worked and some of it didn't. For the existing schools, it didn't work. For the new schools, it did. But what did come out was a General Appropriations Act. It was enrolled in Senate Bill 2800, where they said that they would pull together through the OPAGA office, the Office for Program Planning, Analysis, and Government Accountability, that they were going to review the funding models for public medical education leading to the Doctor of Medicine degree. And this review talks about looking at all the funding models that we have for the state of Florida, and it is in statute. That did pass. Their report won't be out until December 31st, 2007. So we don't know what the report's going to be, and how are we going to work with the budget that we're asking for once this data becomes available.
A couple of component parts to that question. As far as the new medical schools are concerned and their second-year funding, I think that number is what it is. I think your question will be more related to the existing medical schools, either the US, UF, South Florida, and possibly the FAU, Miami Partnership, and Florida State. So that being the case, I think the funds that are being requested here are FSU additional phasing costs. It's the per-student funding mechanism that's being requested. It's an increase in the level of per-student funding to get it to the averages. So I'm not sure how much more that report would add to this calculus. If there is a need for an adjustment, I suspect, and Tim, correct me if I'm wrong, we can work through that process. But this request funds your existing base currently and then goes forward asking for additional funding on a per-student basis. Dr. Temple.
Thank you. Are we also going to have prioritize this?
I can't tell what you're holding out.
The medical. Are we going to prioritize this before the request goes in? I mean, it seems to me the board already has. It said we want to expand our existing medical schools first,
right,
and and the FAU program, and second, or wherever, are the new medical schools.
No, what we're asking for there, and let me be clear because I can understand the confusion, what we're asking for in the new medical schools is a direct appropriation to those new medical schools as per the funding agreement that's been in place. The increase here, the numbers here for second-year funding is an increase resulting from the accreditation, and we'll hear about that in a few minutes. And then we are also asking, because I didn't think we put them in rank order, we said when we approved the medical schools, and we want to fight for additional funding to bring our other medical schools up to par, which is what you're seeing in this budget. Now, there'll be a student funding, which is exactly what you're seeing here. So the goal is to make certain that all this happens, but the allocations in this piece from the legislature would be specifically to the funding of year 2 of the 2 new medical schools, specifically to the FSU phasing costs, specifically to the FAU Miami Partnership, and then to the enrollment dollars and the per-student funding dollars for USF and UF.
Okay, so let's say this gets cut by the legislature. We get a 10% cut. I don't know what the right number is. Are we going to then prioritize where that 10% cut goes, or is it going to go across the board?
I am confident that if the legislature gives a cut in this special unit section, it will be a specific cut in specific areas. I have no doubt that they will not just whack special unit funding. They will,
even though this board has put a priority on how this is supposed to be done. That's my understanding when we approved the 2 medical schools.
I suspect that's
so. Then I guess it would have to come back to us as what we're going to do about that.
Unless the legislature does, if the legislature does it specifically, we'll live with the legislature's will. If they don't do it specifically, I suspect it will then come back to this board.
Mr. Chairman? My question kind of relates to, I guess, Mr. Temple's question, and in general, I'm just a little confused with the idea of the lumping and how we're going to be prioritizing it. What exactly is the methodology that's going to be used? Are we going to, when are we going to make the decision whether or not you do it before or you do it after? Are these going to be done at the board level, or are we going to be using, I don't know, administration at all the universities on the micro level to help us make decisions? When exactly are we coming up with that timeline, and do we have any ideas of where that's going?
Sure. I think the short answer is this is going to be a very active committee over the next several months and years, fortunately or unfortunately for those on it. We will be taking input and working through the prioritization process to and through the legislative cycle, I have no doubt. Chancellor, I don't know if you have any other planned schedule for this. My understanding, I'm sorry, is that Chancellor?
No, you're on point. Each of the universities does have work plans that we have received, and we're going to be very attentive to those work plans. That'll be a transparent process that'll go through the committee.
Governor Zachariah?
During the discussion about the medical schools, we all knew one of the major concerns in Florida was the residency program. And during the final vote for the two medical schools, the legislators in attendance, they all assured that they will fund residency programs. Is there any funds in any one of our request legislature to increase the residency programs?
Tim, guidance there?
Excuse me, what was the question again?
Additional funding.
Is there any funding at all to increase the residency programs in this $9 and $7 million they're requesting for FIU and Central Florida?
No, there are no additional funds requested in our budget for residencies.
Certainly not in the new med school pieces, Dr. Zachariah. Those new med school pieces requests and this enhancement is purely as a result of the need to front load for the accreditation process.
For privately funded residencies as part of the development of our medical school. So if, no medical school, no residencies, but we do have agreements for approximately 90-some residencies to be added over a period of time in the Orlando area in conjunction with the development of the UCF Medical School. Well, there will be no state funds through this body, at least, involved in those residencies.
It's very similar, and I want to assure Dr. Zachariah that we remain committed to the residency portion of our commitment. And in all our clinical discussions, we have emphasized that we understand it to be our mission to not only establish the medical school, but to expand the number of residencies throughout Florida. And we're sincerely hoping that the federal government and our partners will provide those dollars for those residencies. And I think that's the reason why we haven't seen it in the budget so far.
I'm sure that the existing medical schools are also shouldering some of that burden.
That's no doubt.
When the new medical schools were went through the presentations, there was a specific plan and a funding plan with partners to increase the residencies. Is that still in place? And so when you say you hope the partners will share that burden, but there was a specific plan and a number that were a number of people that had hospitals or other. So
yes, it's still in place. What I refer to, Madam Chair, is that there's significant disagreement right now about the amount of federal funding versus the amount of institutional funding that would be needed to start new residencies. There's also a bill, as you may know, before Congress now to overall expand the number of residencies throughout the country, which would be a boon for Florida because we get the largest increase in terms of the cap, which I believe is 380 or 390 new residencies, which would be funded by the federal government. So that's the only issue I'm referring to is the respective splits in financial responsibility for the residencies.
Chairman, may I say one other thing? But during the presentations, we recognized the limitations of the law that were in place at that time. And the presentations did not take into consideration hopeful change in federal legislation. There was a specific plan for residents. And is that what you're referring to, Dr. Zachariah?
Well, there was a little more to it, if I remember correctly, because one of the things that I feel comfortable that the new medical schools had their plans. They've reconfirmed those things. They've been jiggered in the case of FIU a little bit. And I think y'all gave a presentation just the last meeting or the meeting before. But there was also an emphasis on the current medical schools attempting to work together to re-examine the inventory of residencies that they had, to attempt to develop residencies, get rid of some and add different ones that were more appealing to whatever the disciplines were that people were actually wanting, so that we could keep more students here in Florida. That most of the thrust of this was to increase the number of of Florida-trained physicians in the state, and based on the data that we had, the residency was more the determining factor to that, and that we had a lot of residencies that weren't as attractive because of the types of discipline that they were in. So that was part of the overall thing, and we've not ever heard a report back on that. And that's one of the things that I raised 2 or 3 meetings ago, that I would really like to hear that part of the report, because that goes a long way towards the full utilization of existing medical schools, not only fully funding their ultimate capacity, but the students that were not funded, but also having robust residency programs that are able to attract the kind of students that we want to remain in Florida and treat our population.
Dr. Hitt, and if you could, I think the core question, Dr. Zachariah, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but the core question is, the 2 universities said you were going to deliver X number of residencies. Are you still going to deliver X number of residencies?
I just want to clarify what I said to Madam Chair's question. The question of our production of residencies that we guaranteed is in toto there. I was just trying to respond to Dr. Zachariah's question about why there was not a request for dollars for the medical schools for the creation of residencies. So the specific piece about federal funding and our intention to have our partners fund the residencies was in response to his question concerning the lack of specific funding for residency programs.
Dr. Hitt?
Just to go back to the point, we had in our proposal 95 that would be funded locally. Those are still in place. Provost Hickey just reminded me that we're in discussion with the VA hospital. It's now going to be built on the same site as our medical school. And they are discussing 75 additional residencies through the VA. So we're not just delivering on what we promised, but we may be in the process of significantly expanding that number.
Chancellor?
Governor Zachariah, let me see if I can put this in perspective, in terms of the questions that have been posed. As it relates to the residencies, there are currently, beyond what the institutions have committed to, 2 initiatives. There has been this past year at the state level an initiative which our medical schools participated in that I believe was not successful through the state appropriation process to get additional residencies. That was not something that we directly worked upon, but our medical schools were engaged in. Second of all, at the federal level, we are very actively working with Senator Nelson, as well as through the governor's office, for this broader national residency initiative, Dr. Berkman pointed out, by which we could be, as a state, the primary beneficiaries. So that's part 1. Part 2, as it relates to the commitment that our board has to help the current medical schools, there was an initiative this year that was unsuccessful with the state legislature. In large part, it was unsuccessful because we did not make a good case for what the average cost for medical education FTE was. And that is one of the reasons that the OPAGA study has now been called for. And my sense about that is, until we can make a good case for what it costs to actually educate a student for medical education, for an MD, whether it's $45,000 in FTE or $57,000 in FTE, until we can convince the legislature that our numbers work, I think it's going to be difficult to make very much progress in the expansion of our current medical schools. And that links back to revenue that might or might not be available from faculty practice plans to continue to underwrite those unfunded FTEs or growth FTEs that might be there. We did not do a good job in managing that component of the discussion either. When I say we, I say collectively as a larger medical education enterprise. So as it relates to the residencies, we still have some way to go. Some work has been done. As it relates to the expansion of the current medical schools, we're probably going to have to do a better job of making clear what our costs are and what revenues are available before we're going to see much significant progress there. And that's, I think, why OPAGA came out.
There's
Duncan?
Chancellor, I think that's a good segue to kind of part of my perspective and point on this. And, you know, while we haven't really addressed the increase in the funding from what we originally approved to what's in front of us today, I think we've all had a number of questions and dialogue with each of the institutions about that. And I got to tell you, I've tried really hard to understand and listen to everyone's perspective, and I think there are a lot of people, and to the funding point, I remember standing outside at Florida State at our meeting up there and having everyone vehemently agree their numbers were right, and everyone was talking apples and oranges. And I think that, you know, through Krista and Dr. Lamont and others, they've had a great committee working that's kind of gotten everyone speaking the same language. One of my concerns from the initial vote with the medical schools was the fact that we would look at how do we deal with system-wide medical education and the importance of that communication and that collaboration happening as the new schools are being developed and the existing schools are being expanded. And while I think everyone maybe chats and they talk, I do not, from my understanding, believe that we really have had the deans of the existing medical schools sit down and talk about the statewide medical education plan for this state and how we move forward in the current budget environment and how do we make it work with everyone. And I would like to ask that before this become final and we address this budget, that maybe, Chancellor, you convene that group of deans and have that dialogue and that discussion, and we do explore ways that we can leverage our existing infrastructure with our existing schools, how we deal with the requirements for accreditation that are being asked of the new schools, and all of those issues, because I think it is very complex, and I don't think we're going to get to that answer, and we can go back and forth and have questions, but I really think that the professionals and, you know, that deal with this, I would like to know at least where they can agree and where they agree to disagree as a result of a thoughtful dialogue, rather than having the one-off conversations.
My only amendment to your suggestion, Governor Duncan, as you said before this becomes final, the goal will be to pass this budget out today, again in September, and put it out there. I think the dialogue you're talking about is going to be a long-standing dialogue that all will agree to.
May I say, Governor Duncan, I believe that goes to a higher level than the deans. I would ask the Chancellor to convene a group of presidents of universities with medical schools and have the deans at the table, but I believe it goes to a level higher than the president, than the deans. And in all respect to the deans, this is a very important issue for the university. So, Chancellor, would you please do that, and it will be ongoing. I believe that will be an ongoing group.
I think that is very important. I guess to my point on this budget, and I'll defer to the process protocol, I am uncomfortable approving the additional request until I know at least that issue has been hashed out and I feel like we're all on the same page of, is it the absolute only way to do it, or are there other ways to do it? And so if we could make that somehow, have that dialogue related to that piece of it happen sooner before this budget becomes final. I don't mind passing it out pending that dialogue and resolution, but I really would like to hear back where we've got that dialogue.
Governor and Chairman, I think I would not believe that we can have that total dialogue. I think it will be an ongoing dialogue. I will ask the Chancellor to have at least a conference call with the presidents before that, but I'm not comfortable with the fact that we have a short period of time to approve this pending the recommendation from the presidents and deans. I think there's a timeline that is quite short in this process.
Very short.
And all of us have been, I mean, this is an issue. This is an issue, an increase of costs that basically we can't control. So I'm going to ask the Chancellor to convene that body, but I'm uncomfortable with this being pending that recommendation.
Governor Zachariah?
When we talk about medical education and residency programs, they're two different animals. They're not the same. I don't want to confuse with this committee that's going to make a recommendation at the end of this year with medical education versus residency program, because I know some about it because I've been through one of them. When the presentation was made about the medical school, it was explicitly clear
there was no federal funding for existing residency programs. And the way it sits is, once you apply for residency program, you have to fill it within I believe it's 3 or 4 years, then the game is over. You cannot increase the residency program. Majority of the funding for the residency program does not come from the state. The state cannot afford it. It's over $100,000. Most of the money came from Medicare. And the Medicare stopped many years ago and said we did not need a residency program. When this was discussed, it was very clear that the existing, whether it's University of Florida or South Florida or University of Miami, whichever institution it is, they cannot start another residency program and be paid by the feds. So when they made the presentation, they said there were so many private enterprises were giving the money to start the program, because there is no way a state can afford it. $100,000 a pop per year. It's not going to happen. And I made it very clear, because some of you were not on the board at that time, made it very clear it is not going to happen. So they said private funding. My question is, where is the beef? Where is all this private funding we talked about? People said, wait a minute, let me finish. They said there are people waiting in the wings with tens of millions of dollars just to give it away as soon as the medical school was approved. My question, where is the beef?
And Dr. Hitt just reinforced, so that's the question I just asked.
Okay. The hospitals are still committed to fund these, and Dr. Zachariah, I'll say again, as they have said to you, they're going to pay for them themselves without federal or state funding if necessary. And the VA is 75 are federally funded, but it's part of the VA.
So far the two presidents give me the assurance I'm okay with it.
Dr. Ginsburg, you're actually adding a hospital with more residencies as well?
We'd love to, but we haven't gotten there. We've added an orthopedic surgery residency. It took us 2 years to establish that, but
not a new hospital.
Well, one day we hope so.
Was the plan to have new residencies with your new relationship with
Baycare, but that the CON did not go through.
Okay.
So,
well, let me not confuse.
But I really appreciate what Governor Duncan has said about, we just got done talking about the online and how we might work more together. It seems to me that we could work together in ways where we don't need to have 10 different professors teaching anatomy when we have podcasting and all the rest, where we may be able to get together and help one another, which would be great.
Let me try to bring a summary to where I think we are at this point before we explore Governor Temple's question. I think where we are at this point is we've asked the Chancellor to convene the presidents and the deans to talk about synergies that may come about from all of the existing med schools and the new med schools, either in assisting on the accreditation component, as Governor Duncan has pointed out, as well as on a go-forward basis, as Dr. Genshaft is pointing out, where there are some systemic synergies that can help us work together, work more efficiently. That said, we've also asked for a summary, at least I'm putting words in Governor McDevitt's mouth, of where we are statewide on residencies, what we may expect coming down the line, and that the medical schools and the Chancellor, if you could coordinate getting a report back to us as to the state of residencies in Florida, if you will. So we've got a convening of presidents and deans with regard to system synergies, and a report out on where we are with residencies along these lines. Dr. Kavanaugh.
Governor Perez, just to clarify that, I think that's a terrific summation of the discussion, but one of timeliness. I would hope that actually participation could happen prior to the conclusion of the budget submission, so that we would understand exactly where we sit as a system prior to the submission. I think part of it is ongoing, but part of it is timely before the submission.
I don't disagree, Dr. Kavanaugh, and I think what we're talking about, at least listening to Chairman Roberts, and certainly my position would be we would pass this budget subject to further conversation, subject to changes that may result from those initial meetings, but we want to be able to focus on a move-forward basis. And then if new synergies are found, we can certainly modify the budget subsequent. Governor Pettit.
Just as a point to the two current medical schools are up and running, our staff could benefit from a summary of the kind of collaboration and cooperation you two schools have before we do convene the meeting, so we could get a sense of what our benchmark might be and how you're already taking advantage of your current efforts.
Great. Thanks.
So, given the flux of all this and then the APAGA report and others, is this more of a lump sum approach like the online and the other initiatives, or so that we can?
There'll be specific lines, Dr. Genshef, with regard to the FSU additional student phasing costs, or that one may be rolled up. Well, no, that will be a lump sum. There'll be a lump sum, a specific line with regard to the FAU-UM partnership, which is a continuation of funding. There'll be specific lines with regard to UCF, FIU Year 2 funding. Those cannot be lumped. Those are the funds that we're going to need specifically allocated. And then if there is additional funding, the enrollment growth funding, not the enrollment growth funding, the per student cost funding, that will be lumped, so that if it comes in, we can allocate it in some reasonable manner across the existing medical schools to meet the needs as fully as possible. But there'll be some specific allocations in this grouping. Dr. Kavanaugh?
Prez, in kind of your wisdom in submitting this, I would just advocate that I think we do want to take a little bit of time to look at the lump sum approach. We certainly have, I think, a concern about not exposing any vulnerability to the existing medical schools.
Mr. Kavanaugh, I think the explanation from the chairman of this committee is how we'll deal with this issue.
Other questions there? Now we can move into Governor Temple's question, which is, and we'll address it to, I guess, Provost Berkman and Dr. Hitt. Clearly there is a disparity in the projected number for Year 2 funding for both of the med schools as a result of the accreditation process. We've all been fairly well briefed by staff and probably individually by some of you with regard to this increase in budget request and corresponding increase in cost of the process. And I guess, Governor Temple, not wanting to put words in your mouth, but what happened? Did you know? Could you have known? Could this have been prevented?
Well, plus, is this a timing increase because something's being accelerated, or is it an overall increase in what was originally projected?
Some of both, I think, in each case. If I may, when we were proposing the medical schools, President Medique and I were convinced that, and remain convinced, that our staffs gave the best accounting they could of what the cost would be, knowing what we knew then. I still think that's absolutely true. The pressure that we exerted was to ask for enough, but nothing excessive, try to hit the numbers right on the nose. I'd also just say we've just gone over our commitments that we made with respect to residencies, which were a very important part of the consideration, and we have fully met those to this point and even exceeded. We also, in response to concerns about what the impact of the new medical schools would be on capital budgets, we pledged that we would get our capital budgets met without any PICO funding, any new PICO funding. We would raise money through private philanthropy to be matched by the Cortellis program. We are absolutely on track with that, and I believe FIU is as well, if my information is correct. So the parts that are really more under our control, I think we have really done well in staying on point and on budget. What has come up is that as we've moved into the discussions with the LCME on accreditation, some items that we had said we would fund in years 3, 4, 5 have been moved up. And so there is some acceleration of funding. Of course, that adds to the cost in a specific year, but it doesn't influence the total budget when everything is phased in. However, there are also some items that have come up that have to do, as I understand it, with a change in the way instruction is done. The LCME is telling us, for instance, They want us to reduce the number of lecture hours and increase the amount of instructional activity that takes place in small groups. Well, that is, if you will, more labor intensive, and we're having to hire more people to do that. Now, I'll leave it to our provost, Terry Hickey, and our dean, Deb German, to get into the specifics. But, Governor Temple, I think that is a quick summary of the problems that we have faced. And I will say again, we gave you the best estimate we could, knowing what we knew, and relied on a good bit of experience that we had gained from others. It would cost so much per year for 10 years to do the medical school. New facts have come to our attention. There are, in fact, some new accreditation requirements that have only been put in place July of this year and will take effect July of next year. We're going to have to meet those if we're going to be accredited. So that's really the situation we find ourselves in, and reluctantly we've had to come back and ask for additional funding.
Dr. Hick, could you, or Provost Berkman, just as Governor McGibbon just said, what the nature of those that increases the funding for the long term? We're front-loading faculty, you're having smaller classes. What are the requirements that are causing the front-loading here?
Well, just to emphasize what President Hitt said, and for those of you who remember the breathless presentation of Dr. Eglin when he arrived in Gainesville with a few minutes left in the meeting, what he emphasized was that these medical schools, this new core of medical schools, are under a set of accreditation requirements never been used before. This was the first time around. This data set, which controlled how we did our self-study, was the first time it was used to accredit new medical schools. So what he said in that presentation, and it's come to practice, that LCME is also learning what these new standards mean and how these new standards need to be applied. Then, as Dr. Hitt said, on July 1st, 2007, the Commission passed a new set of accreditation standards, okay, which required the medical schools to add additional capacity in certain areas. And I'll just go through them briefly, and the deans can talk to them in more detail. The most important one, excuse me, is the change in the nature of the curriculum. The LCME is asking medical schools to change their paradigm. From a large lecture format, okay, with one faculty member talking to 80 students, to a paradigm of small group learning with 8 students in a section, technology-driven, clinical material pushed further into the beginning of the medical school experience, and all of it integrated with technology in the library. So there's a brand new paradigm, basically.
This is starting year one early in their
This is starting year one early. I mean, for example, and I was to every LCME meeting, all right? For example, okay, we had originally believed that it was not necessary to have as many faculty in as many areas hired by the time of the site visit, okay? When we went to a subsequent meeting, we were told that their interpretation of the standard now is you must have all your master teachers, all your theme leaders, all your components, and faculty hired by the time of the site visit in November. So the major issue that we are facing is this accelerated schedule and the need to hire both more faculty, but also more faculty on the clinical side of the equation than the basic science side of the equation. In addition, okay, the requirements of information technology and how that must now be integrated into the curriculum. It's now a laptop curriculum by and large, okay, have really magnified the cost of IT. And the other area where it's expanded is in terms of how all that relates to what a medical library would look like. We originally believed we could use an extension of our library, and that what we had to do was sequester a portion of the library, and that could be the medical library. Subsequently, we learned that cannot be the case. They require discrete study areas with IT capacity,
with a server loaded with the curriculum, with the ability of students to use that IT on the library site.
So, Governor Kemp.
Hey, not to get in the weeds here, I hear you, I understand it. But we got between the two schools, or two schools combined, we got a $20 million increase. And I want to know how much of that is, roughly, how much of that is an acceleration of the program? Is it half, or is it, and how much of that is increased costs? And we still got another X number of years to go in the plan. What are we looking at, given what we know today? What are we looking at in terms of that increased overall budget? And then it gets back to, can we afford it? That's what I'm trying to get at. I understand your reasons, you've given us examples, but, kind of where is it? Is it 10 million of the 20 that's increased because of the requirements, or is it? And then what is your estimate on what that's going to do in future years to the overall, against the overall proposal to build these medical schools?
Both UF and USF
you don't have
just
to
went
answer
through
that
the
today.
new accreditation.
Yeah,
We
you don't
just
have to-
finished it.
You don't have to answer that today, but I think before we make a decision on all this, we ought to know what the new forecast is and what it's going to cost us.
I asked that same question.
Is that right?
And what I have been advised, and someone correct me if I'm wrong, particularly the real challenge and why this is such a burden to the new universities is the timing issue of when they bring their faculty online and what they've got to plan in their small groups. Existing universities, when they come up for reaccreditation, are going to have to comply with these same standards. I think they both got very long reaccreditation processes.
We just completed ours a month ago, and you just completed yours recently too, on the new standards, brand new standards.
And the benefit is you've got that faculty in place already.
Bringing the presidents and the deans together makes so much sense, because we can help one another.
We fully concur with that. Reaching the point of the dollar side, though, because my concern was, if this is an issue for these medical schools, in 4 or 5 years, will this be an issue for the existing medical schools?
Well, I want to know how this changes the overall projection. Not just, we can see it's a big number. But I want to see a revised projection, because when we approved these, it was based upon a plan, and, you did the best job you could. I understand that. Things change. I just want to know what the magnitude of that change, what you think the magnitude of that change may be.
I think those numbers are in the packet, Governor Temple.
Mr. Chairman, I'd just say that the changes in the accreditation requirements that I'm referring to were just passed on July 1st of 2007 and are not effective in terms of the accreditation process until July 1st of 2008. So the schools that have just been reaccredited were not reaccredited with those additional standards.
Great. Governor Pappas?
My question is, I appreciate the explanation of the existing schools, because that was one of my questions. I also just personally would like to say you can dismiss from my comments any implication that you didn't do the best you could do with the information you had at the time it was presented. I take that as an absolute given. There would have been no motivation to understate the numbers in this order of magnitude. What concerns me is that we made a decision, and we're very concerned about the impact on the other medical schools, understandably. And so one of the factors that we were sensitive to is if these numbers continue to grow, and now look at a shrinking state budget and available appropriations, by definition, it's going to have an impact on other programs, whether it be medical schools or not. And so my sensitivity is a value engineering point, and that is, when you do this in my kind of business and the number goes out of whack, you go back and you start trying to figure out how to work within the budget that you have. And I'm sure that you made some efforts in that regard, but I don't see that information contained in here, and I'd like before I make that decision, I'd like to know that there's skin in the game on both sides here, because more money's coming out of the public's coffers, and to what extent can we reduce that impact in other areas, even if it means it's not an ideal world, because $20 million is a very sizable sum of money. The other question I have is, I'm not clear on where LCME is in its decision-making on this. In other words, have they said, no way, we are not going to give you this accreditation unless you do every single one of these things? Or are we simply anticipating that reaction and then, going what amounts to the easier road, which is producing everything they're asking for? I don't understand that process, so I'm not trying to pass judgment on it, but my question is this premature, and are we taking the negotiating leverage, so to speak, off the table by saying, okay, well, here's this additional sum of money? So I'm happy to understand whoever can give me some information on that.
Let me first ask, Provost Hickey, you're standing at the mic. Might be a bad decision, but you're at the mic. Can you respond to Governor Pappas's question as to where LCME is on this process?
Well, I can't speak to what advantages a long-established medical school has in the LCME process, how much negotiation there is. I can only tell you what the LCME officials have told the UCF team, and what I understand they have told the FIU team, which is similar, and that is there are certain musts that we must do in order to achieve accreditation. They have also pointed out a number of things that they want to see in changes in medical schools, both new ones and existing. The impact on us is immediate because we're building medical schools. The existing medical schools will face these same things when they come up for reaccreditation down the road. They do have the advantage of having larger faculties, larger bases to draw upon to meet the new requirements. We don't. If we don't, my sense is, and it's based on input from people who have had long histories with LCME, if we go into our November and December site visits, December for us, November for FIU, if we go in there without showing that we have the budgets necessary to implement the medical education programs that they are saying are required, then I think that we put our ability to become preliminarily accredited in enormous risk. The issue of how much this costs, front-end loading, the front-end loading for UCF is $10 million. It's hiring the same people that we were going to hire that were in our original budget, that are in our original budget, but it's hiring them 1 to 2 years earlier to meet LCME requirements. And thus, since those are recurring expenditures, they ripple through the system, and the total impact on those is $10 million. The total impact of new hires or new facilities is $6 million, but again, since it comes early on in the process, it too ripples through the system, and that turns out to be $47,750,000 at the end of 10 years. So the total impact of this for the UCF College of Medicine is a little over $57 million over the next 10 years. That will bring us into compliance with the LCME requirements that are in place now and that will come into place in the next 2 years. What have we done to try to lessen this impact? One of the things that we are in the process of doing right now, our Burnett College of Biomedical Sciences has just assumed the status of the Burnett School of Biomedical Sciences, and it will be merged with our College of Medicine on the 20th of this month, thus providing a number of biomedical science researchers and the salary line supports that go with them. So we have done everything humanly possible internally to reduce the cost of these expanded requirements.
I'd just like to clarify something for Governor Temple's question. The $10 million
of front-loading is...
Could you please introduce yourself, please? Thank you.
A clarification, the $10 million of... Oh, I'm sorry, I'm Deb German, I'm the new dean of the College of Medicine at the University of Central Florida. The $10 million of front-loading is over 10 years, not in the first year, because you were asking what the cost would be in this budget year, so I just wanted to clarify that.
Our cost in the first year, the difference in our cost, I'm not quite sure where the percentages came from in the calculation. I suspect they looked at this year's, our requested budgets for 0809 relative to the budget we have this year, which is $4.7 million. The requested budget for 0809 originally was a shade over $9 million, and the amended budget is $13 million. So it's really about a $3 million impact for fiscal year 0809.
To Governor Pappas's question, which I think is a very good one, and to Governor Temple's, if I may, let me read a letter that we got from the a piece of the letter we got from the LCME when we received our endorsement for a site visit. It says, quote, "In its review of the submitted materials, the LCME took particular note of the appropriateness of the timetable for curriculum development. The LCME, which is the council, also pointed out the importance of solidifying the various sources of financial support for the development of this educational program and the need to proceed expeditiously in the recruitment of all theme leaders, master teachers, and other instructional staff who will be pivotal for the design and implementation of the educational program." So, at least in accreditation language, Governor Pappas, this is as rigid as they get in terms of saying that this is an absolute expectation when we arrive that these people will be on site.
Let me point out one more thing, too. I don't think I made it clear. When the UCF College of Medicine budget reaches asymptote, when it reaches its final level of state funding, with all of these changes, it will be $6 million a year more than the original request. So the ongoing impact is $6 million a year.
President Kavanaugh, then Governor Mosley.
I just want to start by saying, obviously, as they say, we don't have a dog in the medical school hunt on the surface. But, in thinking about the conversation that's been going on, and particularly the last question, in the context of a zero-sum game, we actually do have a dog in the hunt, in the following sense, that I think, for what it's worth, we all have a lot of programs that come up for accreditation, whether it's disciplinary or whether it's SACs. We all get letters back from the accrediting body, whatever it is, ACSB or SACs or whatever, that, quote, require certain things to happen, whether it's additional faculty or sufficient budgets and so on and so forth. And so I would simply encourage the board to think about that and, the extent to which, in addressing what is clearly a requirement by the LCME, are we going to get ourselves in the position that every time, when I want to open up an MSW program or I get my ACSB accreditation, and they look at me and say, you need more faculty or you need X and such, at what point are we engendering that conversation for all the programs that are subject to accreditation? Additionally, because, as Governor Pappas points out, we are in a tight budget situation. If indeed it is a zero-sum game, then we all have a stake in the decisions that are being made about the budget. And so I think it's important for us to keep in mind that even if you don't have a medical school, the decisions that get made about the funding will indeed have ripple effects one way or the other. We look at the institutions that have medical schools as we can provide feeder arrangements with our students into those medical schools. So we're very interested in the expansion of seats and so on and so forth. So we do have a stake in it. But I would simply point out that there are lots of programs with accreditation, and those are issues that we all have to grapple with all of the time in terms of trying to set the priorities. And I think that the steps that we just heard about in terms of UCF and merging schools and programs and all that kind of thing. Those are exactly the kind of steps that we all take all the time to try to meet those accreditation issues. I don't do it in the medical area, but we certainly do it when we're looking at American, Chemical Society or ACSB or whatever. So those are indeed important issues, but I would just encourage the board just to be careful about how you go about doing that.
Thanks, President. Chancellor?
This is an appropriate discussion, but I'd like to make sure that we understand or we have a sense of the following, that it would be very difficult to prove the counterfactual, that if the medical school initiative had not occurred, that the additional funding would have been available for programs in the system. Frankly, it's likely that that funding would not have been available. And I would submit to you that the evidence for that is that when the Florida State University Medical School was created, and I was sitting on the other side with many of you, we did not ever have a discussion, publicly and frankly, privately, that, geez, if that FSU Medical School hadn't been created, we would have that additional money to deal with the $41 million in base budget cuts that we took in 2001, and with $148 million in base budget cuts we took in 2003. So it may be intuitively zero-sum in that sense, but the policy process doesn't work that way in actuality. At least that's the experience that I have had. And further, if the discussion continues to go into the domains of the accreditation dynamic, then I think it invites down the road continuing discussions by all of us about every accreditation exercise and dilemma that each program confronts. And if that happens, then basically we have returned to essentially a lawless system in which the decisions that are made are subject to the next debate. And while that may make sense in a pure democratic context, it does not work when it comes to building programs and institutionalizing programs. But the point I would like to leave you with, the counterfactual doesn't work. That is to say that, geez, if we just didn't have these medical schools, this additional money would be available for our enrollment growth for other programs. There would be no way to prove that, and our experience, at least my experience, suggests that that's not the case.
Governor Wilson?
Sorry if this question goes back to a kind of previous detail, but through all this, I kind of got lost on what the exact agenda is going to be for the presidents and the deans getting together, and how that relates to this current budget.
Thanks for that question.
And are any of these conversations able to be kind of tabled to our deans and our presidents so that they can give us some recommendations on what they believe system-wide would be the best decisions?
Thanks for that question. Let me give you my response to that, subject to correction or disagreement. We've asked the presidents and the deans to come together for two reasons. Number one, on a system-wide basis, to have an ongoing conversation on any kind of system-wide synergy that can be found, ability to work together, use of faculty together, podcasting of classes, sharing of resources, finding efficiencies in the system, particularly on the medical education component, and then hopefully, as Governor Duncan has requested repeatedly, on other areas as well. Start that dialogue of system synergy. On a more specific basis, we've asked them to come together and see if there is any room to work together to reduce some of the costs that are associated with this front-loading of this accreditation process. And if there are, great, and if there aren't, we want to make sure the conversation is had. I don't think either of these presidents really wants to sit here and be asking for this additional funds. I think they've worked their budgets as well as they can. However, it seems to be a reality of the circumstance. So if there is a way to find some synergy, I think the goal is to do that in those conversations.
How does that relate to the budget? So if they come back and say we found these synergies,
we would make it, if they can come back and say we found these synergies, we can modify the budget request by X amount. We will certainly do that if we can get that done prior to the budget submission deadline. That's the plan. Governor Zachariah.
Mr. Simon, I do agree with Governor Pappas, Governor Duncan, and Governor Temple. I do sympathize with President Hitt and Dr. Beckman. They're in a difficult situation. My question is, when we had our prior meetings, the LCME was here huffing and puffing. Where are they? Why are they missing in action? Did we invite the LCME to be here in person so we can ask them some questions? And I have another comment after. Go ahead, Mr. Chairman.
Well, we in fact had considered that, but really we thought it would be important to have the internal discussion first, and then we would consider inviting them back. But we think it's very important for us to speak with a common voice and when we do, then we'll be ready to have a conversation with them.
The question that I had was, when they came here last year, they knew or should have known they were going to change the guidelines. They knew or should have known that they were going to increase the requirements. And they made a very rosy picture. I'm not blaming either one of the presidents of the university because that's the information that they received, and they based the budget on the information they received. But I believe that the reason LCME is not here because they don't want to answer those tough questions. That's exactly why you're not here, not because of Mr. Plane, because the last time the guy missed he missed 2 planes, he came huffing and puffing. I believe that the idea that Governor Duncan has is a great idea. The other deans of other universities have great experience with accrediting agencies. Let them all work together and help the 2 universities. These 2 universities must get accredited, and I think the other deans can help them get that.
And I think that there is universal acceptance to that suggestion.
I just want to make sure that we do that before we go to the budget process. That's what I was like.
I'm going to go to Governor McDivitt, then Governor Temple, then President Hitt, then Dr. Kavanaugh.
Well, this is just in the nature of piling on, but I just was taken by some of the comments that Provost Berkman made, and he used the words, you've got to have so many classes, and then you have to use technology. You have to have so much space for the library, but you have to have technology. Well, I don't know if they're talking to you separately and they're saying the same thing to these folks over here, but it seems to me that that's a perfect invitation for how you might be able to share some of these things. And it seems to me that there's common curriculum in all these programs, and that these conversations really need to yield some really good ideas that need to be sold to these people. I mean, that would be my opinion anyway.
Governor Temple.
Yeah, Tito, my request is very simple. I mean, before September, when we're going to vote on this, I would just like a new projection. I asked for it before. We had one when we made the original projections. A lot of numbers are floating around here. I understand the 20 million is an increase over last year's appropriation, but that doesn't mean that's an increase in your timeline. I understand that, but I don't see the timeline in it. So I'd like a new projection on each school, and over the 10-year period, I guess is what we projected out, and what the cost is going to be, and what our overrun is going to be, and before I can consider it. I think I would assume everybody else would like to see that as well.
Governor, that's a reasonable request. And with your permission, I want to add on to it, because each of the existing medical schools have also made substantial requests for additional funding in this process. And
I don't exclude those. I think we ought to know what it is.
Well, and what will be interesting to me to know would be not only the extension over a 10-year period, but also how many new students each of those extensions gets us. In other words, if we're going to spend $100 million, how many more students and chairs does that get us over a 10-year period? We're going to spend $200 million. What does that mean in student growth? So if we could have that from each of the med schools for the next meeting, I think that'd be helpful.
You have that in your packet on page 52.
I think it is there, but I think, and that's why I said those numbers are in the packet, but we can get a more clear spreadsheet with that information in it, so that we'll see where those numbers all shake out.
Chairman, before you go forward, the chancellor today is going to, in his free time after this meeting, call the presidents, arrange a schedule of meetings with the presidents and the deans. And I think that's very appropriate and a good idea from Governor Duncan. So we'll have a schedule immediately by tomorrow.
Terrific. Thank you, Madam Chair. President Hitt, then Dr. Kavanaugh, then Provost Davis.
several points real quickly. Certainly, we've got the projection today. We'd be happy to share it with you today. Just, as a reminder, we're going from 18 or 19 million to say 24 million at the end. So it's that kind of increase. Secondly, I think the Chancellor made a very good suggestion. It would be very helpful to me, and I assume it would be to President Nadeek as well, to have in advance of the discussion that the presidents are going to have an illustration of the kinds of collaboration taking place between USF and the University of Florida and FSU at present. How are you working together to save money in the manner that's being suggested for our two new medical schools? You've got a lot to teach us, I'm sure, in that area, and we are eager to learn. And then finally, I think the Chancellor really made an excellent point. It's one that I wasn't planning to bring up today, but we hear a lot about zero-sum games. In some sense, I understand that, but anyone that's been a student of the Florida political process for very long chuckles when they hear about zero-sum games. There are amounts of money bigger than we're talking about here that float up at the end of every legislative session and get attached to one university or another, and nobody even bats an eye. And we've all been part of that at one time or another. So you've had the current Speaker of the House, the future Speaker of the House, and other prominent legislators stand before you and say repeatedly that if you approve these programs, they would fund them. They're still saying that. So I'm sympathetic. I understand that we're asking for a good bit more money here, and everybody feels that they may be contributing in the near run a little bit to that. I understand that. I've been there and done that. I've got several of those T-shirts in the drawer at home. But it is, I just have to say, let's not kid one another talking about zero-sum games. This isn't one, and the larger game we play is not one. I would like to talk about how we're going to make this work. I made a pledge when we were asking you and the other presidents to support our medical schools that I would work as hard in the future to get more money for the existing programs as I would work to get new money for ours. That pledge still exists. It still holds. I still do it. But I would like to work together to make this work rather than find ways to try to unravel it.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dr. Kavanaugh.
Governor Perez, we've covered a lot of ground on this topic this morning, and I appreciate the dialogue. I also appreciate the emerging suggestion that our deans and presidents will have a voice prior to the closure of that. I would like to make an offer, though, to the board right now this morning. We have with us this morning Dr. Bob Watson. He is not from LCME. He is one of ours, but he is the point person on our campus that handles this. If this decision is going to be based at all on the accreditation changes, I would like the board to hear directly from him. He arguably may be one of the most informed people in the room about that. So with the board's concurrence, would like Dr. Watson to actually speak to that issue.
Actually, I'd be thrilled if he could speak to the presidents and the deans on that issue as we work forward. Our clock is...
He'd be happy to do that.
Dr. Kavanaugh. Thank you. Provost Abel.
Thank you. I have a great deal of sympathy for the situation that these two institutions find themselves in. We, as you know, we started a medical school and received a similar letter from the LCME under some different circumstances, different rules, and we felt that they were unreasonable and wrote a rebuttal, and we were denied accreditation. And the problem with that is the negative publicity that it brings to the institution, to the state, and to this body to have started a medical school and not sustain what the LCME requires. I don't like accrediting bodies. However, a few of them, including the LCME, makes the difference between your students being able to go into a residency or not. They did things like we had 12 arts and sciences faculty teaching in the basic sciences. They did not allow us, they didn't tell us prior to the visit, but the site visit, they excluded those faculty from the teaching faculty, saying that the dean must have direct responsibility and assignment role over those faculty. So we went through a very unpleasant piece. being from America, we're litigious, so we got our lawyers and went up to Chicago and met with the appeals board, and we got no relief whatsoever. They said, this is what we told you you had to do. You had to have this many faculty, this deep, in this curriculum, and until you achieve that, you will not be accredited. So the downside is huge to go down that road and get turned down, because this board made a commitment when they approved the medical schools. And I think whatever you do, you've got to sustain that through accreditation.
Thank you, Dr. Abel. And what I'd like to, I think this horse is sufficiently beaten at this point. What I would like to do, and my goal would be, in following up on Dr. Abel's commentary, I don't think this is the time, the place, or the right decision to rethink our commitment to medical education and new medical schools. I think that is done. It's been well met in the legislature and across the state, and we're advancing forward with that process. So the question becomes, this budget piece, how do we more efficiently, more effectively manage this increase that's been requested by the universities as a result of the changes in accreditation? I mean, I think that's what we're getting to. That said, we've asked the presidents and the deans to come together to try to find some synergies. We need to make certain that every possible cost saving that can be made is being made, and then we need to move forward on this budget item. I mean, I don't think this is the time to say, well, it's going to cost an additional $4 million this year, so we're not sure this is a great idea. I think we are well past that point as a board and as a system. So, are there any other questions or topics on this, or can we move forward through the budget process? Great. I hesitate to say, next item is our, I believe, Tim, that wraps up our existing presentation on the board budget, correct?
That takes care of the university's budget. The only thing left is page 58, which is the board general office budget.
Right. You want to, is everyone with us on the board general office budget? Tim, you want to walk through that quickly?
Yeah, there's really only two changes, or two requested increases, one dealing with Southern Regional Education Board membership dues, and one auditor position to assist our inspector general. I will point out that this budget does not take into account any budget reductions we may have after the special session, so we may have to come back and look at this later on.
Okay. Any questions on the board budget? Chancellor, any comments on the board budget? None. Questions from anyone else? All right, terrific. Now let's go back into the fun part of adopting as much of this as we can. I think when we begin, let me reiterate what I said at the beginning of the process. The goal would be to pass out as much of this budget as we can so that staff can begin to format and put it into component parts so that we can submit it to the legislature on the appropriate forms. We've pulled a few items out of here for committee consideration. We've left the door open for universities to come back to us for areas that require additional funding that may have fallen out during our lumping process, particularly top of mind, the FAMU request, the UCF request, and any others, and we're asking presidents and or provosts to get to the chancellor before our next meeting any numbers that are there that need some attention and need to be included in this budget. Any questions on that piece of the process? All right. What I'm looking for now, let's do the easy ones first. Motion just to adopt the general office legislative budget request for the Board of Governors, the one we just looked at, and to give the chancellor the authority to make any technical corrections to the budget. Got a motion? Is there a second? Second, Dr. Chase. Any discussion on the board budget? Seeing none, all in favor, please say aye. And opposed. The motion carries. There are, I don't know if the minutes, if we'll be able through the minutes to reflect which pieces of the board budget we have set off to committees. I guess the minutes will be clear there. It was, in order to make sure the minutes are clear, it was the $15 million and change for the graduate health insurance, which we've asked Governor McDivitt's committee to take a look at. Again, let me be clear for the record, by moving any or all of these items offline today, it does not mean we're not going to support them. It simply means that we haven't decided to support them as a board, and we want to follow committee processes to get that done. Governor Martin.
Just a point of clarification. What is the time frame that we're working under to approve the budget? And is there a need for us actually to approve items today if we're coming back in September for another meeting to handle other items? Could we not just wait until then to approve the whole budget? Is there a sense of urgency to do this today? Just a question.
Tim, do you want to respond to that?
Budget must be submitted to the legislature and the governor's office on October 15th. There is an arduous process that they put us through and processing that budget, so any action that you take today will allow us to at least get started on some of those things, and we can modify stuff after additional decisions have been made in September.
Do you have to have our vote to do, I mean, you've got a pretty good sense of where we're coming from. Couldn't you get that head start and then let us take a vote when we've got everything clean in front of us?
We could proceed along that way.
I'm just asking.
We could do that.
Well, there is a process that we follow historically that the legislature and executive branch has a comfort with, so we need to take that into consideration today. There's a history of this and how we work with them. Is that correct, Tim?
Yes, ma'am, you are correct.
Okay, so just as a follow-up, Tim, don't go away. Assuming that we approve certain items today, then what is the process that staff goes through in order to work this through the system? Just a brief statement on that.
The governor's office and legislature provides us with detailed budget request instructions every year, about this thick of instructions. They have a very archaic budgeting request system that takes many hours to get through. So there's a lot of data inputs that we must process, a lot of narrative that must be written. There's other requirements. It's just a very burdensome process. But it takes generally about 6 weeks from start to end.
So the concept, Governor, if there are areas that we know we are going to fund, even if it's not the exact number, at least they can begin that staff component piece. So for instance, on the medical education piece, I had said I would like to pass that through today. If we know we're going to fund a portion of that, which I presume we will, we need to pass through those categories that we know so they can fill them in and start that process so that then any subsequent changes can be done after our September meeting towards the end of the month to meet that October 15th deadline. That's the goal. That said, with their special session, maybe they'll extend the budget deadline back. I don't know, but I would, to the extent we can make life a little easier for staff dealing particularly on areas, categories that we know we're funding, I'd prefer that we do that so that the last minute additions can take the rest of the time.
Mr. Chair, would it be possible for us to, and Tim could probably answer that, those numbers that you have deferred for discussion, could we leave those out and go, and if the board approves the other items, either in whole or line by line, then we could start to enter those in. I don't think it would be good if we assume that the legislature or that the governor will postpone. My sense is that they won't postpone, and we should not operate on that notion. I think it would not hurt, it would hurt our board if we did.
Yeah, and I'm not arguing to postpone for that. I'm just putting everything on the table that maybe they will. So in the perfect world, or at least from my perspective, and I suspect staff's, we would pass out as much of this budget and those categories that we know we are going to fund in one way or another so that the process can begin, and then we will come back, and if there are numbers to be made, changes, if there are changes or synergies coming from the presidents and deans on the med schools, we'll make those changes. If we need to add the categories on the 3 items that I have requested that we pull, which is the graduate student health insurance, the funding for the ocean vessel, thank you, Governor Pappas, for correcting me, I said boat, and the global initiatives area, if that money needs to come back in, we'll have the opportunity to do that with whatever additions come from the other universities. there any objection from anybody to taking that approach, knowing that the numbers will be subject to a report back from all those various reporting back entities?
Chico, I just want to make it clear that for the medical school discussion, it includes all of the medical schools, and all the money that is in this table for the medical schools are up for discussion in terms of synergies.
The goal is, yes, I mean, we will be putting, we put the special units number in the budget subject to the synergistic conversation from the presidents and deans across the board. Thank you, Dr. Chase.
Which I think would be a great advantage, to the existing colleges of medicine, because it will help us defend the cost per student. Excuse me, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry.
Governor Temple.
Yeah, I still want to see the updated projections on the
Absolutely.
two new medical schools, subject to that.
There is
broken
no doubt.
down. I mean, this page 52 doesn't.
Yeah, and Tim, perhaps you can get with Governor Temple afterwards and find out exactly what would be more helpful. You're all right, Governor. It's a little confusing in several pages apart. We'll work through that. And I would also add that on that breakdown, I want to know how many new students are put in chairs as a result of that funding as well. And if it's possible, by the next meeting, just for purposes of closing this gap, if we could get that update on residencies across the state system, that would be very helpful as well.
And Mr. Chairman, can I ask that we have LCME present to the President's Council?
I don't know if we can ask or make LCME do anything, Governor, but we can certainly ask them. Based on Provost Abel's comments, I'm not sure how flexible they're going to be with regard to those presentations.
We can certainly have information.
Absolutely. Nice suggestion. Thank you. Okay, so where we are now is I would be looking for a motion that the board adopt the 2008-2009 SUS legislative budget request, and the chancellor have authority to make the technical changes as needed, subject to the removal of, from this budget line, maintaining the funds, but the allocations to the graduate student program, the ocean-going vessel, the Global Initiatives Program, until such time as those committees meet and decide whether or not to put them in the budget, and any subsequent changes that might be made by virtue of our presidents and deans conversation. Is there a motion to that effect?
So moved.
Got a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
And a second, Governor Morgan. Any additional conversation?
And just as a point of order, we will have those three areas. Those committees will meet and may report prior to our budget committee meeting in September. Yes. Okay. Seeing no additional discussion, all in favor, please say aye. Aye. And opposed. Motion carries. Finally, in the past, our committee and our board has passed a resolution supporting that this board advocate for additional funding for need-based financial aid for the Florida Student Assistance Grant. It's not our budget item. It's not something that we would fund through here. It's in cooperation with the board, the state board's initiative for need-based financial aid, so that we can continue to push that. Tim, do you want to give a little bit of background on that before we ask the board to support that resolution? We've supported it every year in the past. It encourages need-based financial aid. Just about 2 minutes.
Yes, this budget is in Commissioner Blomberg's area. That's where all of the student financial aid programs are housed, and this board has been on record in supporting increases in those need-based programs.
Great. Commissioner, do you want to add anything, or are you okay if we support and endorse your program? Okay, is there a motion to that effect?
I so moved, because it really is part of what the Student Affairs Committee committed to a year and a half ago.
Thank you, Governor. And a second, any additional discussion? Seeing none, all in favor, please say aye. Aye. And opposed. Motion carries. Is there a motion to adjourn the committee meeting? So seconded. We'll stand adjourned. We can reconvene the Security Committee meeting in about 10 minutes?
You can get them back.
If I can get you, okay, 15 minutes. 15 minutes, we'll reconvene for the Security Task Force.